In this video, I'm going to walk you through how to implement the Slack OAuth flow in a Node.js application. All of the code samples are going to come from this blog post, and you can get the link for that in the video description below. So let's get started. Okay, so I have a blank VS Code project open here, and we'll start by just creating a couple of the files that we'll need. So we'll touch app.js, and we'll also touch a .env file. And then once we've made those, I'm going to run npm init to generate us a package.json. And we'll just accept most of these defaults. And that looks great. And then we'll install some of our dependencies. So we'll need for this project a couple of things. We'll need .env to process our .env file and load our environment variables. We're also going to need Express for our API server. We'll use Axios as well to make some HTTP requests. And then this one's kind of optional, but we'll use Express session to store the user's Slack data in a session. So once those things are installed, we'll come over and we can close out this terminal session for now. And we'll hop over into app.js. And in here, we're going to require first .env. And then from here, we're going to actually call this config function. And then we're also just going to basically create a bunch of other variables that we're going to need for the rest of this program. So we'll, create a new express variable, and we'll require express here. And then we'll also, we'll need Axios. So let's do that as well. We'll bring in Axios. And then last, we'll also do this with a session. So we'll say const session equals require, and then this is going to be express session, and then we can save that out. All right. So after that, let's see, we're going to actually want to create a new instance of Express, right? So we'll boot that up and we'll say const app equals express. And we'll call that as a function. And then right below that, we're also going to define a port variable, and we're going to set this equal to 3000. Okay, so we've required all of our dependencies. We've booted our basic Express app, set a port variable that we'll use when we ask the Express server to listen for requests. And then the last thing we'll do in this step is we're going to use our session middleware. So this is we're going to say app.use, and then we're going to, create a new session, and this is going to take a configuration object. It's going to be a secret, and this is going to be process.env, and we haven't added these yet, but we will in a later step. So this is just going to be a placeholder for now, and this is going to be our session secret. Then we're also going to say resave is going to be false. And then we'll say save uninitialized is going to be true. And then we'll say cookie, and this is going to be an object, secure, and this is going to be a string equals auto. Okay, so cool. And now we've got the basics of our application scaffolded out. And in the next step, we'll look at implementing the first leg of the OAuth flow. Okay. Now that we have our application scaffolded out, I wanted to take just a second to review the OAuth flow at a high level. You can see here that we've got this Excalidraw diagram demonstrating the 3 different steps of the OAuth flow. In this first step, some event in our application, which is either the user, visiting a URL or clicking a login button, is going to make an authorization request out to the resource we want to authorize. So in this case, Slack. So we're going to make that request. The user is going to be presented with the typical OAuth screen, right? Where they can review the scopes that our application is requesting access to and click allow. And so when they click allow, Slack is then going to redirect the user back to our application and pass along a code that we'll use in subsequent steps to make a request for an access token. So let's implement that first leg now. So the event in our application that's going to kick off this OAuth flow is going to be a user hitting this auth/Slack URL. And so we'll create this get route handler that as the first argument takes the path that we want to respond to when a user hits it. Then the second argument is going to be this callback function that accepts request and response objects as parameters. And so inside of this get route handler, the first thing we're going to do is create a new variable to store the scopes that we want to request access for. And so this is going to be a string, and it's going to be channels:_red. And then from here, what we're going to do is basically just redirect the user. So we're going to say res.redirect. And that's going to be a function that takes a URL as a string. And so I'm going to open up a template literal, and I'm going to hop out to the blog post actually and copy this Slack OAuth endpoint so I don't mess this up. And we can see here that we're initially passing this client ID query param. So the first thing that we'll want to do is actually include a value for that using an expression. So we'll say client ID equals, and then this is going to be an environment variable. So process.env, and then this is going to be Slack client ID. And then from here, we're going to append a couple of additional query parameters. So we've got client ID. We're also going to want to pass our scopes as user scope. So user scope equals, and then we'll open up another expression. And then that's just going to be, we're actually going to use the encode URI component function here to make sure that that's a valid URI component. And then we'll pass in our scopes variable that we just created. So I'm going to let Prettier do some formatting for us here. And then we're going to add one more query parameter onto this redirect URL. So we'll do @, and then the last one is going to be redirect URI. And that's going to be lowercase URI. We're going to set that equal to another expression. And again, we're going to use encode URI component here to make sure that this redirect URI gets encoded in the right way. And this is going to be an environment variable. So process.env.slack redirect URI. Okay. And basically that's all we're going to do in this initial get handler. We define the scopes that we want, and then we're going to redirect the user from our application back to Slack and pass along a couple pieces of data. So we're going to pass along this Slack client ID. We're going to pass along the scopes that we're requesting access for. And then we're also passing the URI on our application that we want Slack to send the user back to after they've authorized this request. Okay, so let's actually stub that out right now. So we'll open up another get route handler, and this is going to be /auth/Slack, and then we're going to append callback to this route. And then this is going to take an async callback function. And this is also going to have, the request and response available. And then inside the body of this callback function, the only thing that we're going to do in this step is extract the code that Slack sends along on the redirect URI so that we can use it in our subsequent requests. So we'll say const, and we'll use destructuring here to get this code from rec.query. So what this is going to do is when the user hits this URL, our route handler is going to look for a code query param coming from Slack and then extract that into a variable that we can use in the next part of our program. Okay, so now that we've implemented the first leg of the OAuth flow, let's talk about what the second leg looks like. In this leg, our application just received a response from Slack that contains a code for that user's authorization request. Now, in this step, we're going to use that code along with another piece of data called the client secret to make a request to a different API endpoint for an access token that we'll use in the third step to request API resources. So let's implement that step now. Okay, so now that we have our code from Slack, let's use that code to get a token. So the first thing we're going to do is inside this second route handler, let's open a try catch block first. And so we'll say try catch, and then we'll catch this error response. And this is just to give ourselves some error handling because sometimes as we're doing these network requests, things can go wrong. And so inside the try, we're obviously going to get the token, but inside the catch block, let's go ahead and console.error, the error message we get back. And then we're going to want to send a error message to the browser. So we'll say, res.status 500. Then we'll say send. Then this will just be, error, I guess, fetching token. Or getting channels. Okay, so now let's come back to the try block. And inside of this, this is where we're actually going to get the token. So we'll create a new variable and call this token response. And we'll set that equal to an async Axios call. So we'll say Axios.post. And so this is going to be a post request. And then we're going to send that to a Slack URL that I'm going to copy off screen just so I get that right. You can see that this URL is different than the URL we used to obtain the code. So we're going to say we're going to post to this URL. There's a couple other parameters we need to provide here for a post request. Typically, we'd provide the body, but we're not actually going to send a body. And instead, we are going to send some query params. So we'll open up an object and then create a params object inside of that. And then the first object we're going to want to, or the first param that we're going to want to send along is just the code, right? So Slack gave us this code. Now we're passing it back to them, but we're also going to include our client ID, which is going to be, again, that environment variable, and then Slack client ID. Then we're also going to want to include something called the client secret. Now, this is another piece of data that we're going to get from Slack when we register an OAuth application. And like the name suggests, this should be kept secret. So obviously the client ID is something that can be made public because it just tells Slack which client is requesting access. Now, the secret is obviously something that you don't want to expose. So this is going to, this last one is going to be redirect URI. And then this is just going to be process.env.slack redirect URI. So we're sending all of those pieces of data out to this Slack API endpoint to exchange for a token. And if that's successful, then what we'll do down here is we're going to open up some conditionals. And so we'll say if token response.data.ok, meaning we get back a 200 response, then we're going to do something. And then if not, we'll throw an else here, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll come down here and we'll send a message to the browser that says res.status. Set that to 500, which is just a generic internal server error. And then we'll say send, and then this can be, error fetching token. And then we'll append this with the token response.data.error. And this is, maybe not necessary for an application of this size, but is kind of a good practice. Okay, and so let's just check what we're doing here to make sure that we understand how this fulfills that second leg of the OAuth flow. In the first flag, the first leg was all about redirecting to Slack, having the user click allow, and then redirecting back to our application with this code as a query param. Now, in the second leg, our application takes that code. We use this client secret, and depending on the OAuth service, the client ID, redirect URI, those are going to differ, but we're going to most of them use this client secret. And then we request a token, right? And so if that token is good, then we're going to do some additional stuff. But if not, then we send these error messages. Okay, we're almost there. In this third and final step, all we're going to do is use the access token that we got in the second step as a part of the authorization header on our API request to get a user's Slack channels. So let's look at what that looks like. Okay, so now that we've made it this far, the rest of it's pretty straightforward. We've done all the negotiating we need to with Slack to get an access token, and now we just need to use that access token to make some API requests. So inside of our if statement, I'm going to go ahead and create a new variable called access token. And we're going to extract that access token from our token response. So we'll say token response.data.auth user dot access token. And then from there, while we're here, we're also going to store that access token as a part of our session state. So we'll say rec.session.slack access token equals access token. And then we'll also store the user's ID as a session state variable. So we'll say rec.session.slack user ID equals, let's see, token response dot data dot auth user dot user ID. Okay. So we'll save, format all that stuff out. And then now that we have the access token as a variable, let's go ahead and make our API request. So we'll create a response variable to hold that. So we'll say const channels response equals await Axios dot get. So we're going to make a get request. And then I'm going to copy this Slack endpoint from off screen. We'll go ahead and paste that in there and correct that H. Okay, so we're going to pass that, and that's the endpoint that we're going to hit with this GET request. But we also need to pass one additional piece of information as a part of this configuration object. So we're going to open a configuration object for Axios, and then we're going to add a headers key, and then we're going to add an object there, and we are going to pass the authorization header. And then we'll create a string template literal, and we're going to say bearer, and then open an expression, and then this is where we're going to put our access token. And so this is how we're going to pass that access token through to the Slack API to get protected user data as a part of this response. Okay, and so now we've made this request to Axios. Let's do some checking here to make sure that the response was good. So we'll say if channels response.data.ok, then we know we're going to do some things. And then if not, we're going to want to handle that error the same way we have all the other ones. So we're going to say res.status 500, and then we'll go ahead and send an error message to the browser. We'll say error getting Slack channels, and then we'll go ahead and append on our error message from our channels response. So channels response.data.error. Okay, and then inside of the channels response, we're going to want to, this is really just kind of like a two-liner to send that data back to the browser. So we're going to create a new variable called channels, and then we're going to set that equal to the response, right? We're going to extract some of that data from channels response.data.channels. And then since this is an array, we're just going to go ahead and map over this. And so this map function is going to take a callback, and we'll pass it a channel. And then we're going to return just the name of the channel. So channel.name. And then we're going to go ahead and also, while we're at it, just join this together into one string so that our channels variable is just a string of all of the user's channels. And so now that we have that, we can actually send some good data back to the browser. So we'll say res.send, and then we're going to open up a template literal, and then we'll say, authorization successful. And then we'll say, here are your channels. And then we'll open up an expression, and that's where we'll put our channels. Now there's one last step we need to do in code before we can start configuring our environment variables and testing our Slack OAuth workflow. And that's just to actually kick on our Express server when we run this file. So we'll do app.listen, and then we're going to pass it that port variable that we created. And we can pass it a callback function if we want. And inside of that callback, we're just going to log out that the server's running. So we're just going to say console log server running on HTTP localhost, and then we'll go ahead and throw the port on here. All right, so let's finish off this integration. In these last couple of steps, we're going to do a bit of hopping around. First, we're going to start off in Slack actually creating your OAuth application and getting the credentials that we need to populate our environment variables in our app. And then we're going to look at how we can use a service called NGROK to expose our local application to the internet so that we can test this OAuth workflow from end to end. So I'm going to start by hopping back into our application and opening up the .env file. I'm just going to paste the names of these environment variables from the blog post, and we'll replace the client ID, client secret, and redirect URI as a part of this process, but we're just going to leave the session secret as some random string for now, but you should consider changing it with something more secure if you are going to production. From here, I'll hop out into the browser where we can start the process of registering our application with Slack. Once we're out in Slack, we'll click this Create an App button to register an app. In this menu, we'll select from scratch. Then we'll give our app a name and pick a workspace. From here, we'll scroll down to the bottom of this basic information page and grab both the client ID. Then we'll hop back into our app and paste this into our .env file. And then we'll do the same with this client secret. We'll go ahead and save that out. And then we'll scroll up here and find the permissions menu where we'll want to add some OAuth scopes. So we'll find in here channels read, which is the scope that we're requesting in our API call. And then we'll also want to add a redirect URL. But localhost URLs aren't valid as a part of Slack's OAuth process. So what we're going to need to do is use this service like NGROK to expose our localhost server to the public internet. And I'm not going to go over how to set this up, but they've got a fairly straightforward getting started experience. You need to install sort of just a connector plugin basically on your local machine, and then NGROK handles the rest for you in the terminal. So let's hop back into our code and let's fire up the NGROK service. So we'll open up a new terminal, and then we're going to run NGROK HTTP and then pass it the localhost address that we want to tunnel to. So localhost port 3000. And then when we click enter, NGROK should provide us this URL. So this is the public URL that's going to tunnel into our localhost application. And so then we'll come up here in our application for the Slack redirect URI option. We'll add the NGROK URL, and then we're going to make sure that we append auth/slack/callback. And then we'll go ahead and copy this whole URL, save this file, hop back out to Slack. Then we'll click add a new redirect URL, paste that in here, click add, and then save. Okay, and so once we've done that, let's hop back into our application. So we have one more step. So we've got NGROK running, which is going to tunnel any traffic that hits this address into our localhost server. But now we also need to kick on our app server. So we'll go ahead and run node.app.js in another terminal window. And then we can finally hop back into the browser. And I'm just going to paste this NGROK URL, but I'm actually going to remove the callback portion. because remember that this auth/Slack path is what's going to trigger our initial OAuth flow. So we'll hit this, and then NGROK typically shows this confirmation page just saying, hey, do you really want to do this? It's an extra security step. So I'm going to click visit site. Then we get taken out to Slack where we can click allow on our OAuth authorization. Then we should get punted back to our application. And if everything's good, we should see authorization successful. And then if you haven't changed the code, you would see all of your channels here. Awesome. Now you should have a good understanding of how to implement the Slack OAuth flow from scratch in this Node.js application, or really any other application environment that you may be working in. And if you got stuck, definitely check out the blog post on this that has all of the code samples that you can copy and paste into your application. And check out some of the other resources that we have on our blog. We've got posts on how to work with Slack's block kit and how to work with Slack Markdown. So we're pretty obsessed with sending notifications, and we definitely want to help you utilize Slack as a notification channel. So thanks for watching, and knock on.